a surprise to us. We all knew that. Back in December of 2021, there was a safety presentation given before the board. There's a lot of information that wasn't in the report, and I'm sorry if some of it was and I didn't see it. We didn't have a lot of time to do it. But back in 2021, prior to the shooting, Jill Lemon was seeking funding, working with the DOJ, working with the school liaison officer, working with the sheriff's office for threat assessment teams because they recognized they needed to do it. This was just before the shooting. I have documentation from the DOJ where this is talked about. It's Jill Lemon that's doing it, trying to get funding for it, not doing it, knowing you need to do it. Let me get funding for it. And they had these meetings, and they signed a new memorandum of understanding with the sheriff's department. I don't see that in the report. Were you aware of that? That just prior to the shooting, a new memorandum of understanding was signed with the sheriff's department. So not between the township and the school, right, and the sheriff's department, it's the school and the sheriff's department. And under that, they had duties. The duties required them to be contacting the SRO and to be using them in all of these incidents, to be notifying them, to be training and doing all that. And I think that puts a different light for me when I know that. And I know that there's people on that committee that met prior to that. There was a meeting that was supposed to have occurred prior to the shooting, but they kept delaying it, right? Because more things were important. And I'd like to discuss that in depth later. I won't bore everyone with that, but more things that were important were buying property, right? Buying the Dominican Sisters, buying property south of the high school, right? Expanding non-student business. In your report, I think it says what? We have 6,000 students. This is a report from the school and the state. It says right here, we have 6,000 non-district students in our district. 6,000 non-district. So you've got to make clear in your report what's going on here. There's 6,000 non-district students. How many students do we actually have, right? You're mixing apples and oranges. We have this thing called FTE, and then we have this thing called students. We have thousands and thousands of more students that we have to process, that our administration has to process, the non-district students. 6,000. How many do we get paid for? That's what matters. We get paid for 3,000, but we have to provide counseling services, safety, management, facilities, buildings, all of that. And we're only paid for a fraction of it. Right? That's not shown. Peel back the layers on here. How many students do we actually have in Oxford? Would you be surprised if it was 5,000 only? How about 4,000? How about 3,000? We're not a big district, but we've created a big district. We created an empire where our administration sells the seats in our buildings that we pay for with our tax dollars. And they focused on that. And I have all the documentation. That's what the meetings were. That's what they were doing before that. They were working on expanding the non-student business at the expense of what they were supposed to do according to the Michigan Charter for Education. Their obligation was to educate the district students and keep them safe. Jill Lemon's job all along since 2014 says safety. Were you aware of that? 2014. She was brought in from China for their China program to bring in those students. And her job was to keep them safe. She's had a safety role all along. You're missing a really big component of looking at all this. And why she was here. Why was Lemon here? Why was Hopkins here? Why was Throne here? They were all brought in for a non-district program. None of them were qualified to do the job that they ended up. We got the legacy of all those failed projects. The legacy was Jill Lemon, Sean Hopkins, Tim Throne, and these other people that failed. They were not qualified to do the job they did. They were morphed into it because they had to keep them, right? You don't replace them with actual skilled people with qualifications for those positions. You keep them in. And this is the result of what happens. Some other thing, and I'd like to talk to you more about this later. There's some material things in here that are important. In your suicide component of that, when Sean Hopkins was talking and interviewing Ethan Crumley, the shooter, he did not ask things that you said, yes, they're required questions. But one of the things in here is very concerning to me as an expert in this is that the words that he used were you intending to harm yourself or others? The fact that it's in here and not addressed, that is an inappropriate question, a dangerous question, is significant. And I'd like you to alter the report to show and to tell people you don't ask that. You do realize that when someone's contemplating suicide, they're not intending to harm themselves. They're intending to relieve all of the stress and anxiety and pain that they have. They're not hurting themselves. They're saving themselves, right? And they're not hurting others because they're saving others from themselves. So that question, when you ask a suicidal person, will be answered no most of the time. No, I'm not going to hurt myself. I'm putting myself out of my misery, right? So it's really important that you talk to an expert on that and put the right wording in there. So in the future, we accomplish what this one is, so people know what to say, so that everybody knows what to say. And then another thing that's not in the report materially, and I think it's important, is what you have here is a pattern of a child reaching out for help. He did Sabres. There's all this in your report, test after test, year after year, previous year, where you gave a child a thing and you said, tell us how you feel. And he said, I feel hopeless, I feel helpless, I feel desperate, I'm unwanted. Every year he's done that. And you give him this test, and what did the school respond with? Nothing. They didn't even look at it. They didn't process it. So you have somebody that's in crisis, and they reach out and they admit it in these reports, and the drawings, and they admit it. And the school just keeps going like nothing happened, and you totally disregard them. Do you know what that does? That escalates them. When you give them their backpack after they have clearly shown that they are a threat, you're telling them to do it, right? When they tell on your Sabres that they're an extreme risk, and you do nothing, you pat them on the back and say, how you doing? In the year prior to that, in the drawings, are you understanding the pattern here? I think it's important for the overall report on this to understand, to tell other schools, when you constantly have kids in crisis and you disregard them, you are escalating their behavior. You are creating a problem. And it's not addressed in the report. So I got some other things I mentioned, but I'm happy to talk with you more about it later, but there are some other material things that I think can be improved in that report to accomplish the goal at what it is. But I'm going to end with this. There's enough information here. When you look at this, that they were not busy looking at our district students. They were busy trying to grow an empire at a time where our district population of students is shrinking, where they wanted to fill those admin offices and keep their cushy jobs. And they did it knowing they weren't doing their job. They were told. The board was told. Everybody was told. And if you questioned them, you were attacked. You have an army of non-district students that overwhelms the district student population, 2 to 1. Do you think we stand a chance on social media when we speak up? We have a motivated group of people who wants to keep this going because they're getting something out of it. They're using our sinking fund money and our dollars and our buildings that we pay for, right? So peel back the layers. Thank you.
Thank you. Your passion is compelling, and I'm happy to speak with you more about this. Anyone else?
Hello. The first thing I want to do is extend my condolences to the victims' families and the community at large. It's been a rough 2 years for us. There's been some very dedicated people in this community working towards change and accountability, and I can't express words how grateful I am to those people in our community for having the courage to speak out. That said, I have spoken out against Guidepost. I will be the first to say that. I was cautiously optimistic about what we would get in this report. I can stand here today and say that I'm fairly happy with this report, and I want to congratulate you on being fairly thorough and extend my gratitude for that. That said, I do have a couple of questions. There was a lot of talk about mandatory reporting, and that was something that I saw lacking in the report. I didn't really see it touch on that too much, and so I think that's an important topic that we discuss, being that the people that were most directly involved with our shooter were mandatory reporters. And so I think that's another thing we need to be looking at and including in this report. It's another red flag, another opportunity missed for this to not have happened. The other thing you did a very, I thought, definitive job of explaining where people were during the shooting, but it didn't go without noticing that we didn't know where Hopkins and EJAC were when the shooting was occurring. I know that they did not agree to be interviewed, but there is video surveillance and witness statements, other things that could identify what exactly they were doing during the shooting. I think that's something that many of us in the community would like to know. So at that point, that's all I have.
Thank you. Yes.
Forgive me for being unprepared. I didn't read the report. But I have a book, Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness and Violence by Alex Berenson. Now, he draws correlations between the use of marijuana and violence, and he's got pages of scientific abstracts that pretty much demonstrate the correlation. I haven't read the report, but I want to know. Do you have mandatory drug testings of teachers and board members? Do you have mandatory drug testing of drug use of students? I'm asking the question.
So our scope of work was to look at the district, the board, the superintendent's office, to the high school, and everybody in between, to look at the personnel of the district, to see what, if any, role they played in what happened.
Do you have mandatory testing? That was a question I asked, sir.
So to the extent it was ever raised during the investigation that inappropriate illegal drug use played a role in the actions of the district, that would have been something that we would have looked at.
What was the drug use of Ethan? Did you test him?
No, we didn't look into that.
Do you test the parents?
We didn't look into that. So the law enforcement, the prosecutor's office and the sheriff's office, they did an investigation of the shooter. And to the extent that was relevant to their
Did the mental
investigation.
illness experts at the trial mention his drug use, if any?
I'm sorry, the question?
Did Ethan, was his drug use, did any of the experts at the trial of Ethan mention whether or not he was a drug user?
You'd have to ask the sheriff's office and the prosecutor's office.
I'm asking you.
I don't have that.
No.
I don't have that.
Do you, why don't you have an answer?
Because as I said, to the extent it was ever raised during our
Why
investigation.
wasn't it ever raised?
I don't know.
Okay, this book was published first in 2006. It's since been republished. It's a bestseller in foreign countries. Have you ever read it? Are you familiar with it?
No.
Okay. Let me explain. I'm a crisis counselor, or was a crisis counselor, okay? I'm also a victim, okay? If you don't know what's in this book, if this book and what it says is not included in your report, you are incompetent, criminally incompetent. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kara Erskine. First, I thought this was kind of a question and answer thing, so if you guys actually have the answers to Andrea's questions, that would be great.
I'm sorry, remind me again, Andrea.
About mandatory reporting.
So mandatory reporting, I think, came up at one point during our investigation. I mean, certainly it was on our radar throughout the investigation. Did there ever come a point that mandatory reporting was required of the shooter at any point from when he was in the district to the day of the shooting? I know, Gary, we looked at mandatory reporting as it came in the threat assessment piece. We talk a lot about whether they were required to do a threat assessment under district policies. I think we considered that issue that arguably there was a point on the 30th when you saw the math homework that issue came up. Can you speak to that?
Sure. And the mandatory reporting is an issue of reaching a standard of child neglect, and the counselor who met with the shooter on that day indicated that had the parents not sought intervention, mental health intervention for the shooter within the time period provided of 24 hours, that the 48 hours, that he then believed that would have risen to the level of the child neglect necessary under the statute to actually do to make the reporting. At that point, our focus is on the actual 30th. On the 30th, in terms of the actual school policies with threat assessments, even before you get to mandatory reporting, action should have been taken on threat assessment guidelines and policies in the suicide intervention guidelines and policies, which should have resulted in the student being removed from school even prior to the necessity of potentially a report under the mandatory reporting statute.
So are you saying that the events leading up to November 30th, there was nothing in there in any of those events that the teachers who are also mandatory reporters, they had no reason to report to CPS, seeing all of that?
That's a different standard and a higher standard than the standard that they should have reported to, which was concerning behaviors that might suggest physical violence or a threatening situation, or conduct of a student that makes one appear to believe that they're contemplating suicide. Those are different standards and a lower
Yes, they
threshold
are.
standard than the higher standard that's required for mandatory reporting. And so the teachers appropriately reported the conduct, reported those concerning behaviors. Once that was reported under the threat assessment and suicide intervention protocols, certain steps should have been taken, which would have likely led us, as mentioned in the report, to a different situation.
So I want to make sure I understand you correctly. Are you saying that a threat assessment comes first before mandatory reporting?
The threat assessment is the conduct that would necessitate actually conducting a threat assessment is a lower threshold than the conduct that's necessary to actually report child neglect for a mandatory reporting under the Michigan statute. So they should have done, the threat assessment should have been done, but we did not determine that the conduct, the concerning behaviors that were identified at that point necessitated a report under the mandatory reporting statute.
Just so you know, I'm a licensed therapist, and through my training, it should have been reported prior to, because it's not our job to actually do the investigation. It's our job to let CPS do the investigation. So if we have any concerns, whether it's neglect or abuse, to make those calls. What was your other question?
I have the other question. But
Okay.
Before I say that, I think if you read our report, especially when you read the shooter's background up through his interactions with district personnel, I think different people in this room would look at different points in there and say, okay, something should have been done there. Something should have been done here. That was reportable. This was reportable, until you get to the point with the 30th where, we take the position we take in the report that something should have been done at that point. So we appreciate your point of view on this, but anywhere along that spectrum, you'd have different opinions as to, okay, that's the time to now call social services. But as Gary said, we were focused on the threat assessment piece, which is a lower threshold, and you saw what our position was on that. Your second question was on Nick Ejak and Sean Hopkins. I'm going to turn to Chris on this because we spent a lot of time with the video of the shooting, and you can imagine what that was like. And we also spent a lot of time trying to figure out where different people were before the shooting. So this wasn't just about us watching the shooter go through the school. This was, well, where was this person before the shooting, and where was this person? I think we see at some point, we know where Nick Ejak is before the
Right, I
during
would
the
say
shooting?
in the report we focused on the administrators and other people who played major operational roles in what they did as they moved around the school, as set forth in the report. For other folks who were following the Alice protocols and doing what they believed was what they were obligated and correctly supposed to do under those Alice protocols, we focused less on them because they weren't out in the school as assistant principals. The assistant principals were, Principal Wolf was. So that's why we focused more on those other folks who played a bigger operational role as the shooting unfolded.
And I don't think we saw those two playing a big operational role.
Right.
During the shooting.
Right.
We know, and we report on it. We report on it in our report that one of the students ran to Nick Ejak's office, Keegan Gregory, when he ran from the bathroom. So we know that he was there. But the video would reflect that. But our concern, while we looked at the video during the shooting, was what were they doing? What were the people doing to try to save lives? Where were they going? Were they following the training? Were they following the emergency operation plan? Were they doing what they were supposed to be doing? And that's what we report on. So that to the extent that Nick Ejak or Sean Hopkins were supposed to be doing something as part of that emergency operation plan, we would have looked at that. But if they weren't part of that, our focus was on the principal, the assistant principals.
Okay, thank you. Now I have a few questions myself, since Andrea's finally got answered. When you guys were talking about the board and their refusal to cooperate with the investigation and making it part of a condition of employment, I think is the turn of phrase you used. Could you tell us what that process was, or that you witnessed the board take to come back with that answer, like, no, we're not going to do that?
Well, it was a constant process from the beginning to the end that we made it known repeatedly that we were having difficulty getting witnesses to talk to us. And that was problematic because, we can't do a comprehensive report if the witnesses are going to talk to us. Now, we did have access to prior testimony, deposition transcripts, courtroom hearing transcripts. We had access to police reports of interviews that were done right after the shooting with various law enforcement officers. So there was a lot there. But many of the questions that were asked were not the questions that we needed to ask.
Right.
So we kept asking the district to help us make those people available to us. And the district, and you'd have to ask the district why they made the decision that they made to not require cooperation as a condition of employment. They didn't, so we worked around it.
Excuse me, who was your point of contact that you kept talking with? Did you have to go through the lawyer, or was it someone on the payroll, like one of the board members?
Our point of contact was our client, which was the board as a whole. We did not go, as it relates to the lawyers, there may have been some involvement with the district's lawyers for litigations that related to scheduling interviews of people who were represented by counsel. So we did deal with them on that. But on the issue of getting people to talk to us, that was something we interacted with the board on.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand. Thank you. I appreciate your time on this. So the board was out in front of you, all members, even the newly elected ones, and you asked, hey, can you make it part of the condition of employment that people cooperate with this investigation? And all of them said no, pretty much?
This issue was an issue from the first board president we worked under, the second board president, and the third board president.
Okay.
It did not change for me, and I wasn't involved in the discussions or negotiations about whether or not they force people to talk to us.
Is someone in your panel part of that discussion?
No.
No. So who had that discussion with the board?
That discussion would have been by the board, maybe with litigation counsel, its lawyers in the litigation, discussing about who they were going to make available. I don't know, Ron, can you speak on this?
Yes, the discussions with the board on these kind of issues of the procedure of the investigation aren't really areas that we're prepared to talk about. The board, though, it can talk about that and can address it. But in terms of decisions that the board made, those, remain really up to the board whether they want to indicate that. What, as Andy said, we're able to say is that we didn't get authorization. As you can see, it's been reported that they would require the employees on a condition of their employment to talk to us.
So you
I don't know which board members, what each board member's position was on the issue of forcing employees to talk to us on any of the boards that we've worked under.
Okay. And then I know you guys are focusing on the 30th. If we could focus on EJAC for a moment. Did you guys look into his past employment history as to why he would then be able to have access to students such as the shooter?
We did look at the backgrounds of different critical witnesses. I'm not sure what you found that you think we should have focused on, and I don't know, have in front of me what his background was, but I think if there was something concerning in the background, I probably would know it as I sit here now, but we may have it in our files, but is there something in particular?
I was actually under the impression that he had issues at his previous school and was let go, which is why he ended up coming to Oxford.
We wouldn't have gone into full-blown investigations that meant going out and talking to prior employers about their interactions with students or their history at different places, but we would have done open source research on each of the witnesses to see if there was anything that jumped out to us that could have informed the decisions that they made the day of the shooting, before the shooting. So if it's not in the open sources or public records, that's probably not something we would have seen.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Do you have a copy of the report I could have? I don't have internet access to it.
We could send it to you if we can get your,
Do you have an extra copy here?
I could check after the meeting, but we can talk about that? Sure.
I also know.
I think we have one. Yeah.
The cameras weren't logged into that day. Who was responsible for logging into the cameras that day?
This is what we know about the camera situation, that, so you had two security people that were, people that, I don't want to say assigned to the high school. So the school resource officer was assigned to the district. And the school resource officer could be where the school resource officer thought he should be during the day. There was another security professional, Jim Rourke, former police officer. So those two were the primary security folks in the district. They had an agreement, I think it was an informal agreement, that at all times somebody armed would be at the high school. Jim Rourke was off the day of the shooting, previously arranged. Deputy Lewis was off attending to police business, school and police business at the middle school. He told Kim Potts, who was not formally part of the security staff, but because she was a former police officer, carried a handgun while she worked at the school, he told her that he was going to be going up there to check on substance, so that the other gun-carrying person in the school at that time knew that he was not going to be there. So as it relates to cameras, we know from our work that Jim Rourke was the camera guy. Of course, Jim Rourke took that day off. We didn't find any evidence that anyone else was assigned to know how to use the cameras or work the cameras when Jim Rourke wasn't there. If this shooting happened when Jim Rourke was there, our belief is that Jim Rourke would have gone to the shooting to deal with that situation, which again would have meant who was handling the video. And so one of the things we talk about in our report is it's important for an emergency operations plan that you have people, whether it's law enforcement or not, probably not law enforcement because they're going to be doing their job, or security is going to be doing its job dealing with the threat, that there be other people when it's safe, when you've got the office locked down and nobody can get hurt in the office, to go to the cameras, see if you can find the shooter, and then use the informed part of Alice to tell the student body and the staff and the teachers who are locked down, if they haven't evacuated, to tell law enforcement responding, he's in the bathroom, go there, or he's here, go there. And we talk a lot about in the report about how certain students maybe had heard during the emergency that the shooter was in a particular part of the school. Maybe they could have taken action where they were, knowing, wow, he's on the other side, now's my time to run.
Sure.
We
I
didn't
understand.
have anybody on the camera.
I read the report. So if Rourke's not there, no one does the cameras? Should the SRO have logged in?
So, let me back on one thing that, fortunately, there was, Pam Fine was there that day, and she did know how to work the cameras. Now, I don't know that that was part of her job, description, but she knew it, so. when
After
they-
the shooter was apprehended?
After, yeah. So, your question again?
Should the SRO have logged in at 8 o'clock in the morning? This is almost 1 o'clock and there's no cameras on, so nobody can even look at the cameras if they wanted to or cared to. My next question, because I don't know that we really know that for sure, I just want to know if that was his job. Should he have at 8 o'clock in the morning logged into the cameras before he went to the middle school? My next question is, do we know that he went to the middle school? Because I understand that car was abandoned a month before. So I'm just wondering why, because I'm pretty sure Rourke made it very clear that he wouldn't be there that day. He was very responsible in making sure that his absence was going to be taking place. Why did the SRO decide to go that day? And did you see video of him at the middle school?
We have, GPS of his car.
Okay,
going to
so
the middle school.
it did go to the middle school. Because I'm thinking that was kind of a very bad day, I guess, if they had that agreement to be in the building at the same time to choose. Now, obviously, he doesn't know what's going to happen, but we all know if he didn't make the decision that day when that car was there for a month to go the day that the Rourke wasn't in the building, if we know the shooter took 1 minute to walk the hall, you said in the report that this was avoidable. What I'm trying to say is not to completely cast blame, but we need to look at, even after it took place, what was avoidable. So if he's in the building, if it takes the shooter 1 minute to walk the hall, we can assume that it takes 30 seconds to meet him in the hall. Then we have our third victim still with us. I think we all know our fourth victim, there's multiple ways and scenarios that he could still be with us. I know that this isn't a part of your report, but I think it's important for people to hear and the community to hear and for us to find out, because I understand EMS was not dispatched right away. We all think that the 911 calls went to EMS and that EMS knows, and why aren't they there? And I think EMS has taken a big hit as to why they weren't there, but it takes a 911 dispatcher to make that call to dispatch EMS. So we need to find out when EMS was dispatched, because 22 minutes to get into the building, potentially our second victim or first victim can be with us. So I guess I wanted to kind of make sure I said that publicly. That's all.
So my response to the last piece is that we were not focused on first responders outside of Deputy.
I understand.
Lillard. He was in the car coming back from the substation. He heard on the radio what was going on, and he came back. So we don't know what happened at the 911 level. First responders, EMS, and law enforcement. That was beyond the scope.
And I guess I just think, maybe a little bit more focus or comments from Lewert. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me why 30 days the car sits there. This is the day I'm going to go. I know those are probably things you can't answer. I'm not sure why he went the route he did to the high school, but
Well, we did ask him about that stuff, and he just said that was the day he chose to go do that.
well, thank you, Mr. Rourke.
Sadly.
I'm sorry, Mr. Lewert. Yeah.
Sadly, that was the day he chose to go check on that car.
And didn't log into the cameras.
And that's a good question about, we know Rourke was the person that did the cameras, not that he was responsible for doing it, but I think the security office thought it was a good idea that somebody worked that could be looking at the cameras during the day when they weren't doing other things. And the testimony that we heard was that was Rourke looking at the cameras. But again, had Rourke heard a shooting, I know that's where he would have
Sure.
been going.
I believe that
And there
too.
wouldn't have been no one on the camera, and Lewert would have gone to the shooting too. So that's why it's important to
Well,
repeat it.
Lewert had an agreement that we would always have somebody in the building, and Lewert decided to go to OMS after 30 days of an abandoned car being there. He chose that day. So I don't know that we know for sure what Lewert would have done.
Well, I would just say that Lewert did say he told another gun carrier in the building, but your point is well taken.
My name is Laura Lucas, and I did talk with you actually in the end at one point, and I guess one thing I had mentioned is from what I heard being on the phone with my daughter and what she heard in the hallway after the shooting had started was a parent in the hallway who was yelling for their child at the time. And I'm just curious if you looked into how that parent got into those hallways, what they were doing at the school that day. Because again, I mean, it's not like there's anything to blame, but it's something else to look at, and the response and how, you know, a parent made it back there, especially, you know, if EMS and stuff wasn't even able to get there. How was it that the parent was able to get in those back hallways? And it was all the way back in bathroom 1 hallway is where we heard it.
We know that happened. It came up during our investigation. I think what you just said is a fact, that a parent came into the building looking for his child during the
Were
shooting.
they there for a reason? Were they, I mean,
Our understanding was that it was to look for his child.
I mean, was he just, I mean, in the vicinity? I'm just not sure what.
Yeah, I think the record will reflect that he came to the school, was able to, you know, there was law enforcement response coming into the school, so doors were opening and closing, and that's how he came into the school.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm definitely just a little bit confused about why he was in the area and that kind of stuff.
I
And
mean, the reason it's not in a report, I mean, it was a parent coming looking for a child during a shooting, but I understand what you're asking about, how even a parent concerned about that the child might be in a shooting could get in the school. Yeah, I mean, we that came up during our investigation, but we didn't include the fact that the parent came in the middle of a shooting looking for his child in our report. Yes, sir.
Just got a few questions here. First of all, I have heard that Jill Lamond had sent an email to the board and to the superintendent and administrators before this, I don't have the exact date, telling them that they need to get going on the risk assessment. Are any of you aware of this email, or have you heard of it?
It was a big part of our investigation as to who was responsible for threat assessments. Not who was just involved with threat assessments, but who was responsible. And we could never get to the bottom of that. We had different witnesses identifying different members of the cabinet they were involved in it. She was involved with it. Jill Lamont, people told us. She said other people were involved in it. They pointed to the prior assistant superintendent for student services as she was involved in it. But it became clear to us, and our report reflects this, that no one was responsible for it, because we feel like had they been responsible for it and someone been leading this in the way it should have been led, that it would have been a higher priority than it was made.
Was there an email from Jill Lamond saying we need to get going on this?
There are emails from Jill Lamond and other people discussing threat assessments, yes.
Okay, so they
That
just
specific email,
totally
I don't have it in
ignored
front of me,
them.
but it sounds like that was one of the emails.
Okay, so they just basically totally, it wasn't a matter of it got put at the bottom of the pile and they got busy with other stuff. They had people saying, hey, we need to do this, we need to do this, and
Yes.
they still didn't do it.
Correct.
Okay. Another question I have is, what stopped and I forget their names, the two people that were with the shooter in the office, what stopped them from searching his backpack?
So, two things on that. Number one is the standard for searching a student's or a student or the student's backpack or belongings is set forth in the district's policies and guidelines. And the standard is reasonable suspicion. And you could go look at it. We talk about it in our report. What does reasonable suspicion mean? So there's that. To get to that, you need to, consider what's going on in the situation that we even need to do that. And I think we make it clear in our report that there was enough there that a threat assessment should have been done, which we believe would have included a request to search. Policy and guidelines require you to ask, but even if the student refuses, you can still search if you have reasonable suspicion. Moreover, we think it's an extra data point for the threat assessors if a student refuses a search. That should add something to the dynamic. And we believe that had the administration been brought in, whether it was the principal or or the assistant principals or the SRO Lillard, who were all in the building at this time, that we believe things would have gone differently.
I certainly agree with you and understand that, but I can't get it through my head. If I were one of those two people, there's no way in the world I would have handed that backpack back to that kid without checking it. It just wouldn't have happened. To me, it's just plain common sense. And that's a big issue. And I understand one of the people are still employed by the school system, and they're working at a school for troubled kids, and I'd sure like to know how that happened, because that's some really bad decisions, in my opinion.
I would direct that question to the district.
Oh, yes,
I want to be clear on the question you asked before. As I sit here right now, I don't recall every email that we looked at. We looked at tens of thousands of documents, including emails, because we wanted to see, just the question you have, who was responsible for threat assessments. You asked about a specific email involving Jill Lamont. I know I saw Jill Lamont emails, but I don't know if I saw that one.
Okay,
Just want to be clear on that.
okay. Does anyone else recall seeing an email from Joe Lamont telling them to get going on the threat assessments?
Do you recall?
No, not an email like that. The item on threat assessment from Jill Lamond was, prior to the shooting, was as we discussed in the report, was discussion of preparing and requesting a grant to do additional work on threat assessment.
Okay. The attorney, I believe it's Mullins, correct me if I'm wrong, that actually hired you guys, who you guys were technically working for? No?
No. So the Mullins Law Firm was hired by was, I think, given to the district by the district's insurance company. Here's your lawyer.
Okay.
To defend the lawsuits that have been filed against the district. 100% no were we in any way working for or with the district's litigation counsel. We were completely separate throughout the investigation.
Well, the original engagement letter gave this attorney all kinds of powers to do whatever he wanted with this investigation
Let's talk
before it
about
was
that.
made public.
Yeah, sure. So the district hired the Varnum Law Firm to advise them on the investigation. What do we do? The public is looking for an investigation. What are you recommending we do? Varnum brought us in as their investigators. We worked with the Varnum team to do the investigation together, but we were primarily the investigative team, but Varnum was part of it as well. The agreement did say what you say it said. So we had to make clear repeatedly to the community, and then formally recently, I don't know if you saw it, but we addended the agreement to reflect that Guidepost was in charge, that no one was going to tell us, whether it was Varnum, investigative counsel, or the district, what we were going to say or not say in our report. We put in our report that that's a fact, and as I sit here today to the community, is we had the final say. I had the final say as the lead investigator, what was going to go in that report. No one told me what to put in it. Nobody told me what to put out. There were no redactions ordered. It was all on us. So we needed to make that clear. One of the reasons it was done that way is because when you're doing an investigation, you could have multiple parties from the outside trying to get at your investigation while you're doing it. And we needed to have some shield to say, hey, let us do our investigation. We've got counsel involved here, so we wanted that protection. But it was not there. It was not designed to allow the district to have any veto power of what we're doing. And they didn't.
Okay. Was Varnum involved right along, seeing where you guys were at, what you were learning?
Yes.
He was. Okay.
The firm, Varnum.
Yeah. Okay. Because I was really disappointed with the amendment that it was said that it would be given to, the report would be given to everybody at the same time, but both the school system and the residents, but it didn't say the attorney. And
Yeah.
that was created some distrust in my
I
mind.
understand that. I just would ask you to distinguish between Varnum and the litigation counsel, whose job was to defend the district in the litigation, to include the issue of whether witnesses spoke to us. And we talk about that in our report.
Okay, thank you.
Questions? There's one thing I wanted to bring up from the report. There's lots of things, and I'm happy to talk about any part of the report, but looking back at it, there was a section of the report that we talk about the bird head situation, the deer head situation, and the countdown situation. And the reason we looked into that is because the community told us to. And the district said this was a big issue before the shooting. Can you look into this? So all of that came to bear on our decision to look at this. And so we did that. We made a statement in the report that the deer head incident and the countdown had nothing to do. We found no connection between those incidents, the deer head incident and the countdown incident, and the shooting. To be clear, what we didn't find was a connection between the student who did the deer head and the student who did the countdown and the shooter. We didn't find those connections. As it relates to the shooting, we don't know what impact the deer head incident had or the countdown incident had on the decision of the shooter to become a shooter. That's for the prosecutor to look at, why he did what he did. But I wanted to make it clear that we couldn't determine either way. It wasn't part of our scope to determine either way what impacted the shooter's decision to become a shooter, whether it was the deer head or the countdown. But I think that section made it seem like we were saying there was no connection to his decision to shoot and those incidents that were going on around him. That may or may not be the case. Those questions would go to the prosecutor. Sure.
I just want to fill in some kind of things that I thought were very material. I'm going to start by what you just said about the connection between the deer head and the bird head. In threat assessment, you're looking at patterns and trends, right? So you had all these things happening before. We know that the school shut down reporting. I'm wearing my OK to See shirt. They shut down reporting and basically chilled the atmosphere, which is 100% opposite of what they should be doing. Is that correct? They're supposed to be encouraging all reporting. Is that correct?
Yes, the OK to Say program, in fact, recurs.
And I was just at the meeting, at the School Safety Commission meeting, and the person that runs it said, we want everyone to report. We get very few false reports, and reports are good. They're never considered, what's the word that we use, unverified or whatever, because a report's a report for a reason. Someone has a concern, right? And we're very quick here to use the words that we're dismissing these complaints that they weren't verified. The fact is, when somebody makes a report, there's a concern that needs to be looked at. It might not be that particular thing, but there might be something going on at the school that people need to be aware of, right? So you never want to chill reporting. You want to get trends. So what we saw,
talk about that in the report.
right? And so what we saw in social media was an escalation, right? And we have these social media posts that I offered to you, and we had things like, bird head kid was an imposter, deer head kid was the real deal. Okay, threat assessment expert, is that going to escalate somebody? You're an imposter, right? That guy did the real deal, and then you have banter back like, I'll show you. Right?
Well, I think you're asking a question about a threat assessment done during the deer head, bird head time. What were they doing to get to the bottom of it?
No. I'm saying, had they been doing what they were supposed to with threat assessment and monitoring social media, they would have seen these trends. They chilled social media. They chilled the reporting because of these announcements that we're making. Stop making these, things. Everybody's safe. Nothing's going on. But nobody's really looked at these social media posts. You said that one account wasn't. I'm going to disagree with you. I'm going to show you that students from our school were following certain things, and certain things were happening. There was a very disturbing trend in social media, and I think you've seen some of those posts. It's disturbing enough that anyone should have stopped and said, what's going on? Who are these kids? Right? And that didn't happen. So there's other kids that were involved that are wearing a lot of guilt and things, that they were involved in this. They were liking the posts that were driving this on. They were liking the posts that were saying, the deer head, guy was the real deal, the bird head's the imposter. And so what they don't realize, and again, I'm going back to the report. If the aim is the report to stop it in the future, we need to let people in schools know that when you're seeing these trends, you need to look for them and understand that social media drives kids to do stupid things. And so when you're having these meme competitions, right, and all that going on, that somebody that really is disturbed and has reached out to you numerous times with the school to say, I'm really having issues, is seeing this. And it escalates some. And we need to de-escalate it by making sure that this is in our threat assessment policy, that we're monitoring social media and accepting everybody's comments and understanding that you might have verified that that person doesn't have a weapon, but you haven't put out the damage of the community in seeing that and assured the community about what that was, right? It's bigger than just, that's not a threat. It's a threat to the institution and emergency management, right? This is all about threat to the institution. Any loss of education is a threat to the institution, which is part of this threat assessment. There was a lot of policies that weren't really specifically mentioned, in the report. And again, I'm just going back to just trying to get a little bit more detailed for people. We have the policy, threat assessment, the administrative guidelines that were identifying and responding to imminent warning signs. And I didn't see a lot of details about this, but that's been our policy since 2011. And it says that these symptoms from the kids and the signs can be overt, right? They can be in drawings, expressions. They're usually noticed by more than one staff member, right? And they give this list. This was like clear and in front of them. I'd like to see this highlighted a little bit more, that this was in front of them. This was one of their policies.
8410?
This is, yes, 8410B.
8410B. We have that in the report.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, in your report, you don't kind of pull out some of the important ones. I don't think people are seeing the tie. And the reason I say that is I'm going back to the EOP, the Emergency Operation Plan. We've had since, 2015. The state came and made a law, right? The school safety legislation, and then we had the EOP legislation that mandated that every public school in Michigan, every school have an EOP. And they had to have it by 2019, end of 2019. We got money for it. We got a grant for it, right? We did all this work. We huddled up and we created this great EOP. In our EOP, it references certain documents. It says we are integrating this in our safety policy. Policy it integrates, and we have the threat assessment tool. We have targeted violence 2019, averting school violence 2021. These are all things that were provided to the district prior to the shooting. In 2019, the school districts were told, undisputed, that they need to review this every 2 years in conjunction with the law enforcement agency, correct? The purpose of that being that the law enforcement agency is the one that's supposed to be providing the expertise and technical parts to let the school know what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to know these laws, right? So I'm correct when I say that the school resource officer and the person that they use for the review is supposed to be highly trained and specialized in this. Am I correct?
School resource
The person
officer?
who is
Yeah.
the person that they, look, I'm not pinning you, I'm just letting the public know. The person that they're using to consult with by law in the legislation that they're required to do is supposed to be trained in all of these things, to understand school safety, threat assessment, all these things, right? That's why the law requires them to do it in conjunction with law enforcement. That's why we have a memorandum of understanding with law enforcement. We have all that. There is a list of best practices for the training and the level of sophistication of this person, the law enforcement person we use. That's correct?
Yes.
Yes. It's spelled out in these documents, right? And it's spelled out by the state and the federal government. Did our resource officer and the person we did have that level of expertise?
We talk about, Gary, in the report, the training that's required of a threat assessment team. We know some training was done. What do we know about the training as it relates specifically to the SRO?
We know that the SRO attended a training, and or at least was listed as an attendee of the training in 2018 with a national expert on threat assessments. But as we point out in the report, that was done in 2018 without any external threat assessment training done in the years afterwards. And then the internal training, the SRO, from what we found, was not involved in any of the internal training, which, as identified in the report, would not have hit the sort of threshold as we would consider threat assessment training. It's more behavioral management of classroom training and not threat assessment training.
So, but the state, the Office of, the Michigan State Police Office of School Safety, right? Created by our governor and legislation to be the ones responsible for overseeing this. Prior to the shooting, they put out documents for guiding principles for SROs, correct? That was all available. Correct, they did. And what SRO training should be doing and what they should be doing. And the main principle of it is they're the experts. They're supposed to be telling the school what to do, how to do it, and if they're deficient. All right? I'm going to make that case. I'm right on that.
All of the expertise says that when you talk about a team approach to threat assessments, the school resource officer is part of that.
Correct.
And trained school resource officer is what they
So
need.
in the best practices, in the email I do have with, our government and Jill Lemon with copy to other people, and they're talking about the threat assessment teams in June and October of 2021, talking about the threat assessment. In that, they're talking about the need to include the SRO and anything, right? And the EOP, Emergency Operation Plan for Oxford, requires that one person gets identified all the time, and that's the principal, correct? Principal is identified all the time. Something happens, the principal's supposed to know. And so we know there was a complete failure in that. But what I'm saying is the public really doesn't understand the EOP and the ties, because I don't think it's strong enough in your report. Everything stems from and to the EOP, okay? Not the safety policies. The policies are to implement the EOP, correct?
Well, there are policies separate from the EOP.
No,
that are
the
board
policies in the EOP refer back to the policies, and it says that you have to make policies and stuff so the public's aware of what the school's duties are and what they're supposed to be doing, because they're not allowed to publish the EOP, but they're mandated by law to provide certain components of it to the public, and it's done in the form of, you could do the safety, right, the safety policy, or other policies. And in the EOP, it references specific policies. It also references these documents as a part of the EOP. So again, I want to reiterate that the importance of the EOP is your foundation document, everything stems from and to, right? All these documents you see on the side are to make the EOP function, and the EOP functions 24/7, before an incident, during and after, and that's why it's specified in the EOP who needs to be involved, what threat assessment needs to be done, and in there, it says drawings can be concerning, patterns can be concerning, and the whole principle of it is that the principal's supposed to be notified in each school so that they understand patterns, and certain people are supposed to be notified and they didn't. And I think it just needs to be clearer in the report that the EOP is a law, right? Michigan has a law, the school had to have it. When you break the law and you knowingly do it, that's Wilton and one, right? That's on purpose. You broke the law. Okay, they were required to have that EOP update and reviewed by, right, December 31st, 2021. It was due. The other key component that was due was a vulnerability assessment, right? Correct? That's part of the mandatory review?
Vulnerability assessment.
A vulnerability, right, by law, it specifies. And the vulnerability assessment is they have to look back from the last time they updated the EOP, correct? And what didn't they do? What did they do? How can they fix it? So if it was due to the state to be certified that it was done by January 1st, 2022, just what, a month after the shooting, it had to be done by public notice. It had to be done with notice to the community in a public meeting. The board had to review it, including the vulnerability assessment, and approve it before Oxford schools personnel, most likely Jill Lemon, certified to the state that it was done. Am I wrong?
Certified to state that everything in the EOP
Right, it was
is
done.
what the EOP.
Right. So had they been doing the notices from the state, Office of School Safety, that's in your packet, plus I have all those, constant emails, constant notices to the district, and Jill Lemon standing up in front of the board, starting earlier that year, all the way on, EOP updates due by law, EOP update due by law, okay? That's a record, it's due by law, including the vulnerability assessment, right? So that would have required them to look back and go, our EOP requires us to have a multidisciplinary threat assessment team. We don't have one. It requires us to report to the principal. We don't do that. We
I
have to
think their
either.
position is they did.
Pardon?
Their position is they did.
Actually, if in the EOP, they can have that position, but they clearly didn't.
That's a
Right,
different
they
question.
are required to review it with law enforcement. So we have a licensed person looking at that going, you really didn't, because they're supposed to have the training, so they didn't. So had they had the right people in play with the right training, they would look back and say, we didn't do this. Our vulnerability assessment, right, should include that we didn't do it and we're gonna fix it. That could lend to that email they're talking about, like, we kinda have to have a threat assessment team, because now we're getting close to the wire. But this has to be noticed to the public, right? The safety committee meeting was scheduled for December 5th, 2021. Kind of last minute, if you need to have all that done and approved by that committee to bring in front of the board for a public notice to be approved prior to the end of the year when it was due. Again, deferral, right? They didn't do it. There was no way they could have made it. They were doing other things. And I want to keep reiterating, it's law, right? It's law. They did not meet the deadline, am I correct?
The deadline for what?
for the EOP update.
You have that?
The last update we had was that early 2019, so they did not update the document in 2020 or 2021.
Yeah, so this is something that should be in your report, right? I shouldn't have to be, so I'm
It's in our
saying,
report.
In the document, we discussed when the EOP was issued and the updates that were done or not done.
they were not done when required, exactly. They did not comply with the law. The consequence of that is they weren't supposed to be eligible for funding, for safety grant funding and stuff in the future. But that didn't happen because we don't want to penalize people, right, who messed up and didn't do their job. We're going to give them more money. So that's what happened, and if you should read the Office of School Safety minutes from the last meeting, there's no enforcement, so we put these laws in. But I think it's important, if you want to stop this from happening, that gets put in your report. The EOP is the most important document. It's their guiding principle. I have the policy in here where it says that new hires are supposed to know about it. That's not in the report. It should be, right? That's a requirement. And that they didn't meet the statutory deadline that they were supposed to have it reviewed with a trained person, and they didn't do the vulnerability test study. So my question is, I sit here today, they were required to produce it. Evidently, they did produce it at some time in, February, March. That was required to have a vulnerability assessment. That vulnerability assessment should be basically what your report just gave us 2 years later. Do you have that vulnerability assessment?
Joe, you have? Angela?
So in the EOP, as far as vulnerability or threat management, no, it's not in there.
Do you have that vulnerability assessment that they did?
Not associated with the EOP, no.
So they didn't do what they were legally required to do. And had they done that, they would have had,
The document that we reviewed was and the one that was active the day of the shooting was the November 2019 emergency ops plan.
Right.
So if there were any revisions
but the
after that,
update
we
was,
didn't have
was
it.
due within a month. The updated plan with the vulnerability assessment from the previous year and the 2-year period, right, was due, right, was due.
And if it included it, we did not review, or if I don't believe they ever updated it at that point.
So they were required to do a vulnerability assessment to be right where we are today, except they were required to do it by December 31st, which they didn't. As far as I know, we still don't have it. Why don't we have it? That should be in your report.
I think that's right. It's a question for the district if you want these
Yeah, but I'm saying it
vulnerabilities.
should be in your report that they were required to do EOP, they were required to update it, they missed the deadline. They missed meeting the law, and they did not do a required component of what they were supposed to do. The whole purpose of that is to keep kids safe. That's why the legislation's there. So I'm urging you to update your report to reflect that vital, key piece of information which shows that this was willful and wanton. They know they were breaking the law. It's in the minutes, right? It's in the minutes. When you break the law, you're responsible. That's no longer an accident or oops. I heard about the suicide. Do you feel that the residents of Oxford should feel safer knowing all this? Knowing the EOP wasn't updated, knowing all this, and these same people are in charge. Do you think the people should feel safe to have them still guiding the district and making the decisions for all of this?
Well, I think there's two questions in that one question. One is, what's going on today, practically speaking?
Right.
We discussed that in our first report, so I would direct
So
people
we have
to
a
that,
vulnerability
to
assessment.
see what we have there.
There really
As
isn't
far
any
as the
trust.
people who are running the district today, I think that's for you to take up with the board and the district.
Say that again?
Your question is about what's going on today, keeping kids
My
safe.
question is, have they done a vulnerability assessment where they have pointed out all their failures?
So our first report talks about what's going on today at the district to keep kids safe, practically threat assessment and physical security. So I would direct you to that. It's a big report. As far as people that are in charge of doing different things today, that's a question you would have for the district about who's doing what.
Right, but I think it's important for your report to state that to this day, you haven't been provided that vulnerability assessment that would have required them to identify how they did not comply with the EOP and what changes they made.
I have to go back and look at the first report to see what it says about a
Do you
vulnerability
have
assessment.
the updated EOP?
No, it was not provided to us.
You don't. So you don't know what they fixed. I think that's kind of a key, am I wrong? Isn't that kind of important to know what they fixed?
We were able to see a copy of the
Pardon?
draft. Oh, apologies. We were able to see a copy of the draft EOP that was developed by Dr. Williman. So our team was able to observe it in person. We went through the plan. We did see that there was an assessment done regarding vulnerability, but you are correct that the timeline originally for the EOP was not in alignment with that initially, but it has been done today.
It hasn't been done.
It has been done.
The vulnerability assessment has been done,
In the updated EOP, yes.
and you've seen it.
Our team has seen it, yes.
Do you not think that's significant to the report?
It's,
I think all of us do.
again, we're not, this report is backward-looking. For the most part, there are some things we talk about, blocks and bathrooms and courtyards, because it wasn't covered in the first
Right.
report. But the first report was to look at both physical security at the time of the first report and threat assessments at the time of the
Well,
first
no,
report.
I read in your report is one, to do that, and two, to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's what your report, that's right in the first 2 pages. The purpose of the report is to show people where things went wrong so it doesn't happen again. And so a vital part of that is to understand that the school didn't comply with law. It's not in there. It's glaringly vacant. And again, I'm not blaming you. You put together a very detailed report. You don't know much about it as I do in this. But I offered this information to you in assistance to you, okay? And I wasn't contacted numerous times, right? I have all this information.
I didn't get your name.
I'll give it to you later.
Okay, yeah. I mean, a lot of people contacted me, and I
Right,
feel
and I
like
recognize some people. because
everything
I-
that was
I
sent
sat
to
down and talked
me,
with
I
them.
feel like everything that was sent to us during the investigation, we
Right.
definitely
But
considered.
I said it was all there.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is there's material things missing that I believe the community should know. And the
Okay,
biggest
understand.
one is that they didn't comply with law. And so when you're saying that report kind of was that time period included a time they were supposed to be doing a vulnerability assessment. And I'm going to leave it at this. Had they done that assessment with a trained law enforcement officer, with a trained one who met the basic requirements as specified in all of this paperwork, and there's special ones for it, they would have known before the shooting that they were supposed to have a threat assessment team. They would have known that they were supposed to do the principal. They would have known what the process is. They would have known about their forms, and they would have known that certain designated titles are required in the EOP to be responsible for things. And they would have known that they don't have people with those titles. They created fancy new titles because of all of the extraneous stuff. So they would have known all that prior to the shooting, and they should have known it way prior because it was due, right? So it is a critical component. If others disagree, that's fine. Me and the people I talk to think it's very critical, and it is a component of this, and it should be in there. The fact that that was all due, and the fact that the community was not made aware that that vulnerability assessment was required, wasn't done, wasn't provided, and is not addressed in this report because it should be. And at this point, that protective layer of the EOP should be stripped. There is no legitimate reason to be shielding the EOP from the public. You already put portions of it in, right? I understand that personal information, sensitive information, such as the gas line locations and things, the Appendix 6 don't need to be in there. But that basic core of the EOP should be provided to this community because it is the key. Thank you.
Thank you. We received 3 questions before the meeting today from one person. We didn't receive any other questions. One of the questions was about families who did not attend school on the 30th. We have a section of our report that addresses the issue of attendance because community members reached out to us to say they were concerned that people did not attend school on the 30th because they knew there was going to be a shooting that day or that something bad was going to happen. And so we looked at that, and our report talks about what the attendance was that day. We received a list, we were obtained from the district, a list of all the people that weren't there that day. It was over 100 people. We did the best we could to reach out to different families. We didn't reach out to all families. There's information in this list about who wasn't there and why they weren't there, so we were able to take some of that out. There were people who kept multiple kids out. There were multiple days of absences. We looked at the absence thing to try to narrow the number of families. Over 100 families knocking on doors asking families why your kid wasn't at school that day was not an easy thing to do. But we reached out to families, and we had one that responded and said that it had nothing to do with that. We also looked into other things that were in the media about families and kids saying that they knew something was going to happen that day, and we ran those things down. That's in our report, and I think it's clear that outside of the shooter, no one knew that he was going to do that shooting that day, and stayed home because of it. We asked about the culture at the school. The culture of the school wasn't our scope. Our scope was, again, to repeat, was what were the interactions between the district and the student who turned out to be the shooter. And we didn't just look at what were their interactions on the 29th and 30th, which are the critical dates. We went back to 4th grade when the kid entered the district. So our report reflects all of the interactions that we could find and what those interactions meant to the shooter. You know, we didn't talk to him. I'm sure the prosecutor was something that they looked at, why the shooter did what he did, but our focus was on the district, what actions they took and what actions they didn't take. And then there was another question about the huddle process that was in place at the high school. If you recall from our report, we tried to get to the bottom of what was the threat assessment process at the high school. It was clear to us from the principal that what was in the policies was not pushed down, but we also make it clear that that stuff was publicly available for the principal. But their process was a behavioral flow chart and a huddle up process, which was when they saw something that was concerning, they huddled up. We talk a lot about how, you know, that is not a proper threat assessment pursuant to the policy of the district and the guidelines they didn't have. So the question was really about, outside of the huddle up process, were there discussions at water coolers and outside of the huddle up about particular issues that were going on? And that's not something that, you know, we became aware of, meaning were people talking outside of the huddle up process about different students and the threats they posed. You know, we didn't find anything about that in our investigation. It was all about, anytime we saw something concerning, we huddled up. So I wanted to address those three questions before we closed the meeting. But yeah.
Thank you. When we were here last time, I had asked about, so Tom Donnelly and Corey Bailey have been saying that during a meeting that occurred the year after the shooting, that there was a closed door session. I know you were also present in that room, and I had asked that in this report, because they're claiming something happened in that meeting, right? That in quotations, the truth will set us free, basically, but they're not being allowed to talk. So my question was, at that time, would that information be in this report? And the response was, if it was valid. So I didn't, going through the report, see anything that stood out to me. So I guess my question is, was there anything that occurred in that room that this community should know that should have been in that report that was valid?
As it came to me being in closed door meetings, when we started this investigation, we agreed with President Donnelly and I guess the board that we would be left alone. They would not be involved in our investigation. And that's the way we conducted our investigation for a period of time, because it was both, we didn't want to be interfered with, and so it was good that we weren't involved in anything like that. And we didn't want the appearance to be to the community that we were coordinating with the board our investigation. We never did, from start to finish. But there were things that we needed to make this investigation work that required me at some point to go into that closed session to talk about the things that were concerning to me for our investigation. So I don't know how many meetings it was. Maybe it was one. Maybe it was, I know you were probably at that meeting. Yeah. For me to be at a meeting like that, it meant, look, I needed something. I needed help, and I don't know that I'm not that familiar with the laws of open meetings and closed meetings in Michigan law, but what can I say about that meeting? I don't know if I can talk about discussions in that meeting because I think there were lawyers in that meeting. I don't know.
Well, those meetings were closed meetings from the Open Meetings Act because legal opinions were being discussed. Some of those legal opinions related to the investigation. So unless the board were going to talk about that information, they would have the the power to do that if they chose to do that. We don't have that power or ability, so we can't really talk about what happened in those meetings, and that's why they were closed meetings. But as Andy mentioned, the only reason he would have been there in Guidepost would relate to some issue, some procedure that had a legal component to it, and that's why it would have been a closed session. And that's why it can be closed, because they involve discussion of legal issues, legal opinions.
And I would say two other things. Number one is any meetings I was involved in with the board, you can be sure my work, the report reflects anything that went on in those meetings. And the second thing I would say, most importantly, is that we were never interfered with by the board, other than the issue we talked about witness cooperation. The board never stood in our way. We could do whatever we wanted. They gave us what we wanted over time. It took some time to get certain documents. It took time to get certain witnesses. There was some, we wanted to talk to everybody, but that never happened. So in that respect, there was no board interference. But I sit here and tell you today that had someone come to me and said, put this in the report, take this out of the report, I would have resigned, and I would have come to you all and said, this is what I was asked to do. So everything in the report there reflects what happened. It reflects our investigation. But under no circumstances was I going to allow the board to interfere with our work or tell us what to say. And they didn't. Notwithstanding what was said in those closed-door meetings about what I needed for the investigation and what their response was, whatever they said that day, you can see we got a report out. I was able to get it. We didn't resign. So that means that we got the cooperation we needed, with the exception of forcing witnesses to talk to us.
Did they tell you why they wouldn't make it a mandatory participation for everybody involved as a board with the ability and the power in their hands to bring the truth out so this community can start to heal and hold the right people accountable? Why did they tell you that they didn't want everybody to have to cooperate with the investigation, and what were the numbers? How many people cooperated?
Well, I can't tell you what the board's reason was. I never received that from the board. But I heard, no, it was, we're not going to force people to talk.
To the extent that there were discussions on that legal issue in the closed-door meeting, we don't have the ability or the right to discuss that. Again, the board can be asked that question.
And work on them. I understand. I just want to thank you for trying to do your job. Didn't you indicate it's almost impossible to do an investigation when the parties won't cooperate?
We made it clear that outside, apparently, the school, a school setting, that I think I could say in any investigation we've ever done outside of schools, that you are required to cooperate with an outside investigation. You cannot say, we're not cooperating, you risk being fired. And we believe the board had the power to do that, but they made their decision for whatever reasons they made it. I say you should ask the board.
Just to be clear, the board hired you to investigate because they wanted to know what happened, but then when you asked them to make it a condition of employment, they said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to make the people that were the key players talk.
We can't tell you what the board said in the closed sessions. We can just say the result. Andy can talk about the result, that he didn't have that occur. But in terms of what the discussions were, what the board said, what was said to the board, we can't talk about that.
Report that you asked them to make it a condition of employment, and the board said no. That's in the report, right?
I think what the report reflects, and we can go back and look at, is we asked for these witnesses to be made available, and they were not. So, but you should go back and look at that. I don't know what the language was that we said, but the fact is, we asked for it, we didn't get it. Oh, the witnesses refused, that's for sure. But the board's position on the board's position on what they did not, was behind closed doors, and I think, that's a valid question for the board about that question, that issue.
So they didn't really want the truth. If they would make the employees tell the truth and make that mandatory condition, obviously they're trying to cover things up and protect their own skin.
I know they hired us to do an investigation. I know they didn't, other than this issue of forcing witnesses to be in front of us.
Witnesses.
They fully cooperated with us.
Hopkins and EJAC, did they talk with you?
Yeah, the main.
No? Okay.
But why the board did what they did, I mean, I think the board, there are issues of forcing people to cooperate, whether you have the power or not. What is the downside to doing that? I think the board considered that. If we force people to cooperate, what could happen? I don't know, I wasn't in those meetings.
Now they're gonna find out.
In your experience with other investigations, had you a similar situation with just the not wanting to participate and being questioned.
We've done lots of investigations where people don't want to talk. Yeah, people take the,
Similar to this one.
well, this was unique in that it was a school investigating something terrible that happened, and it was ongoing litigation. So the question is really, how do you deal with the litigation, and how do you do an independent investigation at the same time? And I think that was the issue for them. And for us was, we understand there's litigation going on, but we have a job to do. And we need certain things for that job. And I'm just telling you that we got what we got and set forth in the report.
Well, thank you for your work, and thank you for helping expose the board and everybody involved in this that's been trying to cover it up from the very beginning. We thank you for your work.
I have one more quick question, I'm sorry. Real quick, can you confirm the 8 people that did attend the threat assessment training?
Is that in our report, the 8 people that attended?
Yeah, the one prior to the shooting.
What is it? Do we have it off the top?
I know some of the names, but we have to flip to the report.
It's in the report. All the people that we knew attended. It's either in the body of the report or in the footnote
Okay.
there.
We'll look.
I was gonna say, I think it's a footnote in the threat
In the
assessment
footnote,
section that
okay.
talks about, like, if you searched for Dr. Cornell's name within the document,
That would probably be the quickest way to find that pinpoint page.
Sir?
Just kind of a follow-up to some of the stuff I said before. You guys were hired to find the truth, and you said that that's what you were going to do. You didn't want to be bothered by anybody, you just focus. If that's the case, then why would you have signed an engagement letter initially that gave the attorneys complete control over this investigation? That's been bugging me since I first found out about it, and I still haven't gotten an answer that to me makes any sense.
You asked this before, and what I can say is that it's not always the case, but it's typical that when an investigation is done, counsel is brought in to protect the investigation while it's happening, so that the investigative team is not dealing with, there's nothing wrong with FOIA requests and subpoenas and other efforts to get at our work, right? So we were doing this for almost 2 years, and throughout that period, our goal with the way we set it up in the beginning was to minimize the risk that there would be lots of attacks on our investigation while we were doing it, to interfere with us being able to do it. So I hear you. I know what the language says, what it says in that document. What I can tell you today is what the intent was of it and what the facts are. The facts are that even though it says what it says, we tried to put out that addendum to alleviate your concerns. But the only other thing I can say is I'm telling you that they didn't control the investigation. We did. I did. As it relates to the shooting piece, what happened that day, I did. And so you may have in the back of your mind that because there was a lawyer involved, that they somehow told me what to say or do in my investigation because they're counsel to the district. And I tell you as a fact, it didn't happen. It's the best I can do.
I guess it just bothers me that if I were in your situation, and I'm not an attorney, but if I were in your situation trying to do an unbiased, completely honest and open investigation, there is no way I would have signed an engagement letter or contract, whatever you want to call it, that gives the attorney complete control over every piece of evidence you find, over everything that's in that report pretty much.
And I would
to me,
say,
that's just insane.
I would say in response, it took us almost 2 years to do this, and it could have been even longer if every time I turned around, I was having to deal with a legal attack or some other effort to get what we're doing in the middle of what we were doing. So I hear you, but I think it helps facilitate the speed of the investigation, which already took too long, when you have that kind of protection. But your point is well taken.
Did you say that the attorney issued by or recommended from the insurance company to the school, their defense attorney, is the same attorney that already represents the school union, happen to be dual representation?
I don't know that. I know, I think we've learned that
What's that question exactly? The attorney in the investigation, me and Gary is Varnum. We're not.
I know, outside of Varnum, the
Mullins.
defense, yeah, Mullins, is he not hired by the insurance company or recommended from the insurance company to the school?
That's our understanding.
In addition, already represented the school through the union.
I don't know that.
We should know that, shouldn't we?
Yeah, we didn't look into.
Since they were delaying and encouraging the employees of the school. to
I believe
not
the
follow.
union had, I believe the union had their own representation.
Okay. I'll double check my facts then.
I'd like to ask a question.
I have,
Wait,
oh,
Amy.
sorry, yeah.
I guess I'm not clear on this, but, so the EOP that was supposed to be due, December 31st that year, was it, have you seen it, what they had, at that point, and was it ready to go? I guess I'm wondering if they had completed it. I mean, outside of like submitting it and getting the final okay.
Okay.
Have you seen the document?
I would ask you all, and then to extent, Ron, Gary, you have anything on that, but.
So I'll just start by saying, in the document for the investigation, we reviewed the November 2019 copy of the EOP that was in place on the date of the shooting. And then I'll pass it over to Angela.
Well, does in place mean it's the one from, what was it, 2019?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
And then as far as an
but I'm
update
saying-
though,
yeah,
I'll leave that to Angela.
the updated one that they had at the time.
We were not provided with an updated version of it. We were not.
Okay, yeah, 'cause it's, yeah, okay.
We'll be back again at, and we have more time, but we'll be here at 3:30 and 6:30, to the extent you have any questions that you remember then that you don't remember now.